Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. My voice is a bit hoarse today, but probably warm up as I get started. The last thing I did before I came here this evening was I gave an assembly at a local primary school, so hopefully I'll make the mental shift from primary school mode to UCL mode. But as Iggy said, I'm giving a talk about English Catholicism, the last 500 years. Just out of interest, how many historians are there here? Okay, 2. Okay, 3. Okay, that's not too bad. And I'm sure you know a lot of this already, but even those who perhaps aren't a specialist in history, you probably know more than you think about English Catholic history. You know certain phrases like English Reformation, or Catholic Emancipation, or Second Spring. Or you know various individuals in our history like John Fisher, Thomas More, Edmund Campion, John Henry Newman. So my aim tonight really is to give a broad view of the last 500 years, so that all the facts that you know already, you can fit them in to this basic timeline. Now we start roughly 500 years ago, around the year 1514, the eve of the Reformation. It's really hard to believe that England was once a Catholic country. And sometimes you have to look quite hard for the clues, but one very obvious clue, which is probably in our back pocket, is on the coins of this country. A typical coin, on the head side it says Elizabeth II, DG, by the grace of God, Reg, Regina, Queen, FD. And as you probably know, FD stands for Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. And that's a title that was given to the King of England by Pope Leo X in 1521, because the young Henry VIII had written a treatise defending our sacramental theology against the writings of Martin Luther. So if we know where to look, there are lots of clues about the Catholic history of our country. In 1514, the church was in relatively good shape. There was a boom in priestly vocations. Churches were being built and extended all over the country. Pilgrimages were still very popular to shrines like Canterbury, and also various new cults like Our Lady of Willesden or the cult around King Henry VI in Windsor. And many parishes had strong lay associations called guilds, which were partly prayer groups, partly trade unions, partly banks, partly charity. There was great vibrancy in this pre-Reformation church. Of course, there were shadows, as we find at any period in history. But on the whole, the Catholic Church in England was in a fairly good shape. And then, as we know, everything changed. Now, there's no time to go into the details of the English Reformation, but to summarise, at the risk of vast generalisation, we could say that a combination of Henry's doubts about the validity of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and his worry that he had no son and heir, and his stubbornness, and also his Protestant-minded advisers, led to this defender of the faith breaking with Rome. Now luckily the Pope, though weakened in many ways, was strong enough to defend the sanctity of the marriage bond. But Henry, meanwhile, became convinced that the King of England had an imperium, an authority over the church in his realm. And a series of acts in the 1530s were passed by Parliament, limiting the powers of the papacy and declaring Henry's headship of the church. In fact, when I gave my assembly at this primary school earlier today, it was a Church of England primary school, and I started off by saying, "Who's the head of the church?" And one girl said, "The Queen," which is not something I'm really used to hearing, because I normally go to Catholic schools and give assemblies there. So it really kind of made me think. That's exactly what Henry did. He made himself head of the church. And he gave himself permission to marry his sweetheart, Anne Boleyn. Now the English Reformation is full of nuances. Henry is often described as a religious conservative. And despite his break with Rome, he still continued to attend Mass every day. And Mass, remember, was still in Latin at this stage. And he frowned upon Protestant innovations like clerical marriage and justification by faith alone. The 10 Articles of 1536 affirmed belief in the real presence and the necessity of confession. And Henry even passed an act restricting the reading of the Bible to the clergy and those who had an education. So when people say that the Reformation instantly opened up the pages of the Bible to everyone, well, actually Henry restricted it after his break with Rome. Only the clergy and the educated can read its pages. Although Henry sounded Catholic in many ways, his policy regarding religion was radical and it was schismatic. Shrines were destroyed, statues and windows were smashed, pilgrimages were suppressed, and the monasteries, as we see here, dissolved. Now, religious houses had been dissolved before. In fact, St. John Fisher had even dissolved 2 nunneries and used the revenues to found a college in Cambridge. But Henry's policy was something quite new. He attacked the monasteries because of their opposition to the divorce and their links to the Catholic world. The monasteries also provided land and money to his supporters and allowed him to fight some of his wars. But they left behind them not only picturesque ruins, but also a huge gap in the field of education and medical care and poor relief. And the dispossessed monks and nuns, who we have to feel very sorry for, they went away, they were given pensions, and some of them actually continue to live the religious life behind closed doors in their homes. As you all know, these changes met quite a bit of opposition. 1535 saw the execution of several prominent figures who had refused to support the King's religious policy, most notably Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, and St. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester and a cardinal. Also 3 Carthusian priors were put to death. The following year, 1536, there were risings in Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, Cumbria and elsewhere, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, involving thousands of ordinary people who were saddened by the changes to their beloved church. Although, as always, religious motives were mixed with political and economic grievances, the rebels marched under the banner of the 5 precious wounds and criticised the King's religious policy, especially the dissolution of the monasteries. But many people also were prepared to wait. The King and the Church had often battled. Think of Henry II and Thomas Becket. Perhaps eventually things would just sort themselves out. The path taken by the Reformation in England was complex and gradual, and its success was by no means guaranteed. There was a great deal of uncertainty as each of Henry VIII's children pursued very different policies. So we have the reign of the boy king, Edward VI, which saw the continued destruction of Catholic England and moved the Church of England in the direction of Calvinist Geneva. The sacrifice of the Mass was replaced by a communion service. The old vestiges of Latin disappeared, and images continued to be destroyed and whitewashed. Liturgical changes then, as now, tend to be very emotive, and when the old Mass was at last suppressed in 1549 and replaced by the new prayer book, there was actually a popular uprising in the West Country called the Prayer Book Rebellion. The parishioners of one parish in Devon complained that the new liturgy was like a Christmas game, and several thousand lost their lives in the resulting conflict. Then when Edward died in 1553, his sister Mary briefly restored England to Catholicism with the help of her cousin Cardinal Reginald Pole, who was the new Archbishop of Canterbury. He reconciled the realm to the Holy See during an emotionally charged service in Whitehall. He said, "If the angels in heaven rejoice over the conversion of a single sinner, what must be their joy today at the sight of a whole kingdom which repenteth?" Of course, Mary is normally remembered for the controversial burnings of over 300 Protestants during her short reign. About a sixth of her victims were women. And for subsequent generations of Protestant Englishmen who devoured Fox's Book of Martyrs, they remained a stark warning of the perceived horrors of popish rule. But Mary and also Cardinal Pole rather bizarrely died on the same day in 1558, and they left behind them a tantalising what if. As has been suggested by historians, if Mary had lived just for 1 decade longer, then after her death there might have been a union of England and Scotland under Mary Queen of Scots, followed by a Catholic British Empire. The triumph of Protestantism in England, says one historian, far from being natural or inevitable, was the result of one woman's premature death. One of the most crucial dimensions of our story is the reign of Elizabeth I. Partly because she reigned for a long time. She reigned for 45 years. So after all the instability of the previous decades, her long reign allowed things to stabilise. Hopes of a Catholic restoration were dashed each year as her reign continued, and as each Catholic suitor for the royal marriage were brushed to one side. At first, Elizabeth turned a sort of half-blind eye to the Catholics in her country. But then things began to change rather quickly. In 1568, Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived in England as a guest of the Queen. She was a Catholic, and she was next in line to the throne. And so she became the focus of many plots over the next 2 decades. And then shortly afterwards there was another rebellion, the Northern Rising, which tried to restore Mary, or put Mary on the throne. Needless to say, it failed. The following year, the Pope sent a bull excommunicating Elizabeth, actually designed to coincide with the previous year's rebellion. But as we know, sometimes the Vatican takes a bit of time to process its paperwork. So a rebellion and a Catholic claimant to the throne and an excommunication from the Pope didn't exactly endear England's Catholics to the Queen. So very quickly new laws were passed, making it treasonable to call the Queen a heretic, even to bring in papal bulls or other devotional items into the country. Matters continued to worsen through the 1570s. Not only was there a botched papal invasion of Ireland, but there was a new injection of life given to English Catholics in the form of the missionary priests who trained in the new seminaries founded overseas. And the authorities began to realise, much to their alarm, that Catholicism wasn't simply going to die out in England, as it had done in parts of Northern Europe and Scandinavia. It was going to survive. And there were going to be these new, very active missionary priests going around preaching the faith and making sure it survived. One of the most important people, of course, was William Allen, shown here, who later became a cardinal and who founded an English seminary in Douai in France, and also later in Rome, where Father Stephen and myself trained. These produced new blood for the underground English church. Douai sent 440 priests to England during the reign of Elizabeth, so things were certainly changing very quickly. And not only were there a new generation of seminary priests, but also Jesuits coming into the country, the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, men like St. Edmund Campion. So there was a further series of anti-Catholic laws in this country. It was treasonable to reconcile anyone or to be reconciled to the Romish religion. Basically, if you joined the RCIA in Elizabethan times, you were a traitor. And it was treason simply to be a priest. You didn't have to do anything, just to be a priest, no matter how innocent you were, going around your daily business, that was in itself treason. And as we all know, the punishment for treason was the hideous execution of being hanged, drawn and quartered, designed to utterly obliterate the victim from society and memory. It's been estimated that 5,000 people were executed in Europe for religious reasons during the Reformation period, mostly in the Low Countries and France and England. And most of the Catholic martyrs of that period were produced by this country. But the persecution of Catholics remained sporadic. It flared up at times of national crisis, like the Spanish Armada, and it died down in times of peace. In fact, Catholicism survived not only because of the heroism of the few who faced death, but also because many local officials were reluctant to take action against their popish neighbours. It may not have been the most intensive period of persecution compared to some of the more recent ones which we've seen in church history, but the penal legislation remained on the statute books for several centuries. So in a way it was the longest period of anti-Catholic persecution. Many are the stories which have been passed down of these brave men and women making the supreme act of witness. Blessed John Sandys was allowed to celebrate Mass the morning of his execution and delivered a moving sermon to the congregation. Blessed Alexander Crowe freshly shaved a tonsure on his head on the day of execution to show the pride he had in his priesthood. Blessed Richard Simpson embraced the ladder and kissed its steps as he was led to the gallows. Blessed Nicholas Postgate welcomed his execution as a shortcut to heaven, while Blessed Joseph Lambton encouraged his fellow victims with the words, "Let us be merry, for tomorrow I hope we shall have a heavenly breakfast." Perhaps most memorably, when Blessed Roger Renaud was hanged for harbouring a priest in 1616, the rope actually snapped and he fell to the ground, and he was offered his life if only he made the oath of allegiance. And it must have been a rather tempting offer, because he knew exactly what it felt like to be hanged and to be dangling at the end of the rope. But instead, he actually rushed back to the ladder and rushed up, and he said he was the same man as he had been before, and that as he was hanging there at the end of the rope, he had had a glimpse of heaven which he wanted to return to. Despite the tiny number of English Catholics in proportion to the general population, the idea and the threat of Catholicism dominated the national consciousness for several centuries. In fact, the fierce nature of the persecution reflected the insecurity of this Protestant nation. And of course the various schemes of invasion and assassination supported by the Catholic powers, even the Pope himself, didn't exactly help. So Catholics came to be tarred very quickly as traitors, and questions were raised about how you could be a good Catholic and a good Englishman at the same time. From the Elizabethan period onwards, the English Catholic Church takes on a new identity. It's a minority, underground church. Many people lived a sort of double life, attending the local Anglican church in order to avoid the fines, but also receiving the Catholic sacraments at home. And they were called church papists. They go to the official church, but they continue to be papists. But there were also the out-and-out recusants, who separated themselves completely from the local parish. A really radical step, because the parish was not just a religious unit, it was very much at the heart of the local community. And they, of course, regarded the church papists as wimps. They regarded them with great suspicion. There was a great variety in levels of conformity and compromise. It really depended on the individual. It's true, though, that the survival of Catholicism was largely due to those who made their homes strongholds of the faith. Priests would come and go, arriving in disguise and with a whole collection of aliases. Sometimes they were simply employed as a steward or a tutor, and when necessary they made use of the hiding holes that were ingeniously designed by craftsmen like St. Nicholas Owen. Much also depended on Catholic women to make the domestic arrangements for Mass and pass the faith on to the next generation. Let's move on to the 17th century. Not only a new century, but a new era, as the Stuarts replaced the Tudors. The accession in 1603 of James I, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, raised Catholic expectations, and that many of these hopes were very quickly dashed is apparent from the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when a small group of Catholics led by Guy Fawkes nearly succeeded in blowing up Parliament, and that really would have been the 9/11 of the 17th century. But conditions for Catholics generally improved under James I and Charles I. In fact, in London, Catholicism was flaunted semi-publicly, both in the foreign embassies and even at court. That's one of the great contradictions of the time, that the Stuarts, despite being the head of the Anglican Church, despite presiding over these anti-Catholic laws, they themselves had tended to have Catholic wives, princesses from Catholic countries like Henrietta Maria, or converts to the faith like James I's wife, Anne of Denmark. And of course, if you've got a Catholic queen, then you need Catholic chaplains. So when Henrietta Maria arrived in London, she had a French bishop in her household and 27 chaplains. And one of the chaplains of Mary of Modena, when she was Duchess of York, was this chap, St. Claude de la Colombière, very much the forgotten saint of early modern London. As you may know, before he came to London, he had been the spiritual director to St. Margaret Mary. And so he was one of the first people to hear about her revelations of the Sacred Heart. And rather bizarrely, London, Protestant London, where priests were being put to death, became one of the first places where devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus was preached. Hopes were raised once again when Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660. He had close contacts with many Catholics during his years of exile, and in fact on his deathbed in 1685 he was received into the church. But his reign actually saw an extension to the penal laws, especially after the Popish plot of 1678, which was dreamt up by an ex-seminarian with an axe to grind, claimed that Catholics were trying to put the king to death. And so there's a whole harvest of martyrs, including St. Oliver Plunkett, the Archbishop of Armagh. But when Charles II's brother, James II, came to the throne, he of course was a Catholic, and the Catholics in this country certainly thought that things would change for the better. And yet 3 years later he lost his throne, a combination of the unexpected birth of a son and heir, the opportunism of his son-in-law, William of Orange, and also the misinterpretation of many of his policies. In fact, recent research has shown that James II was incredibly progressive for the times. He wanted to promote liberty of conscience and freedom of worship. In fact, when he was Duke of York, his private colony was New York, what we now call New York, and there he offered toleration to the Jews and had close links with the synagogues there. So he had really quite progressive ideas, which were seen, of course, as a great threat to the Anglican establishment. And so, unfortunately, due to all sorts of factors, he lost his throne in 1688. But James, in many ways, laid the foundations of the modern English Catholic Church. One of the big questions for the previous century was, who is in charge of Catholics? We no longer have bishops with dioceses, as we used to have before the Reformation. Who exactly is in charge? For a time it was Cardinal Allen, and then he had various experiments with archpriests and a chapter of clergy and a vicar apostolic. But James was the one who appointed 4 vicars apostolic. These are basically missionary bishops, not with a diocese, but they're bishops and they report directly to Rome. And in 1688, England was carved up into 4 districts ruled by a vicar apostolic. One of the first vicars apostolic was John Leyburn. He was the first to be appointed, and there hadn't been a bishop in England for several decades, so he spent about a year travelling around England celebrating the sacrament of confirmation. And during his tour of the north of England, 20,859 Catholics received the sacrament of confirmation. So quite an exhausting schedule. Persecution began to die down in the 18th century, although Catholics were still a bit suspect, especially since they were often involved in the various Jacobite rebellions trying to put a Catholic Stuart back on the throne. This period is often dismissed as a period of decline, but there were some very important developments. Previously, mass centres were often in remote areas, perhaps in the houses of the great Catholic families. But it was in the 18th century that more and more chapels were built in the great cities where the population was moving. But discretion was still very much the key. The Jesuit chapel in Liverpool was made to look like a warehouse, so no one knew it was a Catholic church. And when a Benedictine priest began celebrating Mass in Warrington, in Cheshire, in the mid-18th century, he travelled there dressed as a packman, and he advertised Mass by getting a boy to sing Sally in the Alley. And when people heard the song Sally in the Alley, they knew that Mass was about to be celebrated. Probably the most famous figure in this period was Bishop Richard Challoner, the Vicar Apostolic of London. A great man, a very holy man who wrote a whole library of books for English Catholics. But he still had to be disguised as a layman much of the time, and he found himself celebrating Mass in London pubs and cockpits. And yet, despite his very discreet existence, he was nominally in charge of the Catholic Church, not just in England or in the London area, but also in the British colonies. So he was Bishop of North America and the West Indies, kind of having this, exercising this jurisdiction from his townhouse in London. A further burden was added by an act in 1753, which said that all weddings had to be celebrated in front of an Anglican clergyman, the only exemptions being for Jews and Quakers. Now this was meant to address the problem of clandestine marriage, but for Catholics it meant that when they got married they had to have an Anglican ceremony just so it was legal, and then have a Catholic ceremony as well, just to make sure that it was valid as a sacrament. So it was a further complication to their lives, and this remained the case until really quite recently, until 1836. By the end of the 18th century things were changing rapidly. There are many challenges to the old order, things like the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And all of a sudden people realised that perhaps the issues of the Reformation weren't the only issues. The new public enemy number one wasn't so much the Catholics, it were things like political radicalism and revolution. So actually we see in the 1790s several thousand French priests being welcomed to England, refugees from the French Revolution. And they weren't seen as sinister priests, but as brave survivors of this dreadful thing going on in France. Some of them founded chapels like the one in Somers Town, very close to here, or the one in Hampstead, which later became parishes. And many of the Catholic institutions which were founded overseas, like the seminaries and the colleges and the convents, they now returned to England because it was actually safer to have one of these institutions in Protestant England than it was in Catholic Europe. So we think of places like Downside Abbey or Ushaw or St Edmund's Ware. In fact, I've got a picture of that just to... St Edmund's Ware. So these really massive institutions suddenly pop up around the country. Having spent several centuries in France and Catholic Europe, now they suddenly arrive in England, and it must have been quite a statement to see these places being built. So the result of all this was a series of parliamentary legislation making life easier for Catholics. The first one happened in the 1770s, but this caused a huge amount of alarm. The Protestant establishment really felt threatened, and the result were the Gordon riots of 1780, when nearly 300 people lost their lives, and several churches were badly damaged, including the church in Lincoln's Inn Fields. The Act of 1791 finally permitted Catholic worship in registered churches, provided the church didn't look too much like a church, so they weren't allowed to have a bell or a steeple. Also, Catholics were allowed to enter the legal and the military professions. The Catholic cause was given a further boost by the Union of Great Britain and Ireland in 1800 to 1801. This meant that lots of Irish questions were brought to the Parliament in Westminster, and it was one of the things that led to Catholic emancipation in 1829, meaning that Catholics could actually sit as members of Parliament. English Catholics were still very much a tiny minority, but two other phenomenon really led to the extension of the Catholic Church in this country. First of all, there was the Irish immigration of the 19th century, partly due to the Great Famine. The Catholic population rocketed from less than 100,000 in 1800 to 750,000 50 years later. More Catholics meant the need for more churches and schools. But of course it also meant that the Catholic community was increasingly seen as a sort of Irish ghetto, and the presence of Irish-born priests confirmed the perception that Catholicism was something foreign to England. That was one of the great accusations. It wasn't natural for an Englishman to be a Catholic. It came from Spain or France or Ireland. It wasn't English. Another key factor was the Catholicizing movement, which came from Oxford, the Oxford movement, rediscovering the Catholic roots of the church and looking to the early church fathers for inspiration. And many of the people involved in the Oxford movement came over to the Catholic Church, most famously John Henry Newman, but also Henry Edward Manning, who became Archbishop of Westminster in 1865. Converts brought with them a great deal of energy and also a great deal of money. Many of our beautiful churches that were built in Victorian times wouldn't have been possible without the resources of these converts. Finally, in 1850, the Pope decreed that England and Wales at last could have a proper hierarchy of bishops with dioceses. Initially there was just one archbishop, and he was given the rather controversial title of Archbishop of Westminster. We're all used to referring to the Archdiocese of Westminster, but think about it. Westminster, the very heart of the British establishment, Westminster Abbey, which actually comes directly under the Queen, and now there's a popish Archbishop of Westminster. It really caused a lot of fuss at the time. The Times newspaper complained that this papal aggression was one of the grossest acts of folly and impertinence which the court of Rome has ventured to commit since the Crown and the people of England threw off its yoke. So it was seen as the Pope being aggressive and trying to get this territory, the Westminster and all the new dioceses, trying to almost invade England. And it wasn't really helped by the first Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman, who I'm very fond of. He's one of my heroes, really. But he was so emotional about the restoration of the hierarchy that he wrote a pastoral letter in which he proclaimed that by the Pope's authority we govern and shall continue to govern the counties of Middlesex, Hertford and Essex as ordinary thereof, and those of Surrey, Sussex, Kent, Berkshire and Hampshire, and so on and so forth. Of course he was talking about ecclesiastical jurisdiction, but it sounded as if he was sort of trying to do a coup and take over from Queen Victoria. One of the lords in the House of Lords, Lord Winchelsea, even suggested declaring war on the Papal States as a result. Anyhow, with the restored hierarchy and growing numbers, the Church found a new self-confidence, and it became increasingly visible. Many churches were built, normally in the Gothic style, just stressing that continuity with the medieval past. In London, in fact, there were 24 churches in 1826, 102 churches just 40 years later. And the church began to have a different feel. In the past, for example, it was the lay patron who had a great deal of influence. Catholics depended on his hospitality. It was the lay patron who paid the priest's wages. He had a great deal of influence. But now it was very much the bishops who were in charge. Priests began to be known as father rather than Mr. In penal times, your priests are normally referred to Mr. Schofield rather than Father Schofield. And they began wearing the rather Italianate cassock and beretta and all the other things that priests on the continent would wear. English Catholics were introduced to a whole range of devotions which they hadn't really been used to before. Things like the 40 hours devotion. And here's a picture I could find, the most beautiful one I could find on the internet, showing the 40 hours at the London Oratory, which I think happens around this kind of time. Perhaps this happened already. There were Corpus Christi processions, May crownings, novenas. All these things would have been unheard of 50 years previously. If you went to a recusant chapel, you would have been quite surprised. It really looked a bit like a kind of Methodist chapel. Okay, there would have been an altar, but there would have been no statues, no stations of the cross. Very, very restrained, unlike the Catholic churches we know today. So the church had very obviously emerged from its recusant shell. One of the big priorities for this new church was Catholic education. And the building of schools demanded a huge amount of sacrifice that I think we often ignore. It was very much the case of schools before churches. And Cardinal Manning famously said that before we bother building Westminster Cathedral, we need to make sure that every Catholic child has a place in a Catholic school. We often forget that up until 1870, education almost entirely depended on initiatives by religious bodies and charitable bodies. The state didn't really get very involved. It wasn't until the Education Act of 1870 that this idea of state schools was introduced. And schools could still be run by voluntary bodies like the Catholic Church, but they basically got no state funding, not until 1902. So up until 1902, it's estimated that the Catholic Church spent about £4 million building schools, and only £60,000 of that actually came from grants from the government. So especially if you've been to a Catholic school, as I have, we should really recognise that huge sacrifices were made just for that school to be opened and to keep it functioning. Of course, now it's a bit easier. Another rather weak area was university education. As I'm sure you know, not until 1895 were Catholics allowed to go to Oxford or Cambridge. Cardinal Manning, who himself was an Oxford graduate, was convinced that the non-Catholic environment of the universities would corrupt souls, and he tried to establish a Catholic university in Kensington, which unfortunately didn't work out. And this is where UCL comes in. UCL has a huge part in the story of Catholic education, because when it was founded in 1826, it had no religious restrictions, unlike Oxford and Cambridge, where there were religious tests until the 1870s. So many of the Catholic colleges like Ushaw or St Edmund's College Ware actually affiliated themselves with UCL, so that Catholics could begin to have a Catholic education. So well done, UCL, something to be proud of. Just very swiftly going forward to the 20th century, when things begin to feel a bit more familiar, the English Catholic Church really had come of age. One historian has called this an era of steady expansion, largely untroubled by internal dissent. There was the modernist crisis at the turn of the 20th century, but otherwise things were pretty united. A very important year was 1908. England and Wales officially was removed from the jurisdiction of propaganda fide. In other words, it was no longer considered a missionary country. Up until then, the Vatican regarded us as a mission country on the same level as, the African coast or the Far East. Then we had the Eucharistic Congress, which came to London, and for the first time since the reign of Mary I, there was a papal legate on English soil, and there was a very public procession around the streets of Westminster. The First World War also had an important part to play in our story. We're thinking about that very much this year with the centenary, but there was a huge push on the home front to help the soldiers in the theatres of war, lots of charitable action from the Catholics. But for many Englishmen, the First World War provided them with their first experience of Catholicism. They went to France, they saw all these ruined churches, they saw the faith of the Belgian and French civilians, and they also saw the dedication of the Catholic chaplains. And there was a huge number of conversions resulting from the First World War. From 1935, the Archbishop of Westminster was this person, Arthur Hinsley. Rather untypical prelate. He spent most of his time as a rector and then working in Africa, but he was then plucked out of retirement to become the head of the Catholic Church in this country. But we should be very proud of him, because one of his great themes was attacking the totalitarianism that was emerging around the world at the time. He wasn't afraid to criticise the Soviet and Nazi regimes. He became one of the principal international voices promoting liberty and justice. So as early as 1938, before the Second World War began, he was speaking at London's Albert Hall against the Nazi persecution of the Jews, claiming that the Emperor Nero was a model of justice compared to Hitler. And then as he was dying in 1943, Cardinal Hinsley's final public statement was produced for the World Jewish Congress meeting in New York. He said, "I denounce with utmost vigour the persecution of the Jews by the Nazi oppressors." So those who so readily criticise the seeming silence of Pius XII should remember the witness of these local leaders like Cardinal Hinsley. The period also saw lots of prominent converts, people like Ronald Knox and Evelyn Waugh, the novelist. Catholics were also becoming a bit more middle class. They weren't so much the labourers of the 19th century. They were now working in the civil service and running businesses, the sort of situation we find today. And the last 50 years, you see I'm coming to an end now, so you can relax. The last 50 years has also seen lots of important changes. We had the Second Vatican Council, the most global meeting of bishops in the Church's history, which opened the windows of the Church and set the priorities for believers in the modern age. As I will always say, fresh air was brought into the Church, but also a bit of stormy weather. There's a saying that a typical general council takes about a century to really happen, to really get into it, to have an effect. And initially there was quite a bit of confusion and disappointment. Perhaps it was a bit unfortunate that the council coincided with the 1960s, with its social and sexual revolution, and the tendency to reject anything that seemed a bit old-fashioned. Many people thought the council didn't go far enough, and as we know, many priests left the ministry, and there was a great deal of dissent in the wake of Humanae Vitae. On the other side, many also felt saddened at the disappearance of old certainties and the changes in the liturgy. Today, Catholics are still very much a minority, but we've become more and more a respected part of the nation. In fact, when John Paul came here in 1982 and then Benedict in 2010, the whole country's gaze was on our papal guests. Recent decades have seen lots of major new developments as well. On the one hand, many of the institutions of the 19th century have been rationalised. Parishes have been merged, churches and convents closed. And added to this are huge changes in society and culture. Perhaps the biggest challenge is no longer our separated brethren, as it might have been 200 years ago, but rather its religious indifference and aggressive atheism. The power of the media also has used its resources in questioning and criticising the church, sometimes rightly, as in the case of child sex abuse, but at times taking things out of context for the sake of a good headline. But also there are many signs of life in the 21st century. In many city parishes there are increasing mass attendance, thanks largely to our wonderful immigrants. There's a renewed interest in Scripture and Eucharistic adoration. There are new movements like Youth 2000 or the Faith Movement or Opus Dei, which have brought new perspectives to the Church. And there have been many positive developments in catechesis and liturgy and youth work. So as we come to the end of this very quick survey, and I know I've chucked lots of facts at you, but hopefully one or two have stuck, we realise that every detail of the past shows the presence of Jesus Christ, who we believe is the Lord of history. He was present in the sufferings of the martyrs and the perseverance of the recusants. He was present in those Catholics who went into exile to train priests or pray for England's conversion. He was present in the lives of those who built our parishes and our schools, the servants of the Second Spring. And now he is present with us. All of us are links in this great chain of faith. So let's pray that we will be faithful and courageous as all of us together write the next chapter of this story. So thank you very much.